For 15 years, David Kingston had worked the night shift at Riverside Chemical, learning every pipe, every valve, every safety protocol that kept dangerous chemicals from becoming environmental disasters. When 5 eco-warriors broke in to expose industrial pollution, they discovered that the man they thought was just another corporate employee was the only thing standing between their ideology and a catastrophe that would prove their point by killing millions. Welcome to Industrial Security Stories. I'm standing outside a chemical processing facility as I tell you this story, watching the steam rise from cooling towers that most people drive past without a second thought. Today's story proves that sometimes the most important battles aren't between good and evil. They're between people who understand consequences and people who only see causes. David Kingston adjusted his hard hat as he began his 38 and 47th night shift at Riverside Chemical Processing, the massive industrial complex that supplied water treatment chemicals to over 200 municipalities across 3 states. At 48, he moved through the facility's maze of pipes, 10 monitoring stations with the confident familiarity of someone who'd spent 15 years learning that industrial chemistry was equal parts science and art, and that the difference between the two could mean the difference between clean water and dead cities. The Riverside facility processed 50,000 gallons of industrial chemicals every night, transforming raw materials into the chlorine compounds, pH adjusters, and purification agents that made tap water safe to drink from Ohio to Tennessee. It was dangerous, precise work that required constant monitoring, split-second decision-making, and the kind of institutional knowledge that could only be gained through years of experience with systems that had no room for error. David hadn't started as night supervisor. 15 years ago, he'd been a junior technician with a chemical engineering degree from Ohio State and theoretical knowledge of industrial processes that meant nothing until he'd learned how theory translated to reality in a facility where a single mistake could create environmental disasters visible from space. His education had really begun during his 3rd week on the job, when a pressure valve malfunction had created a toxic gas leak that could have killed everyone within a 5-mile radius. David had watched the senior supervisor, a man named Frank Torres, who'd worked chemical plants for 30 years, calmly implement emergency procedures that contained the leak, neutralized the gas, and prevented what could have been one of the worst industrial accidents in Ohio history. Kingston, Torres had said after the crisis was over, "You can learn chemistry from books, but you learn survival from mistakes. The trick is making sure they're other people's mistakes, not your own." David had spent the next 15 years studying other people's mistakes. He'd researched every major chemical plant accident in industrial history, analyzed every failure point that had led to environmental disasters, and designed redundant safety systems that were intended to prevent the kind of ideological disasters that happened when good intentions met bad chemistry. What David had learned was that chemical plants weren't environmental enemies. They were environmental necessities that required constant vigilance to remain environmental allies. The chemicals processed at Riverside prevented waterborne diseases that would kill millions, neutralized pollutants that would poison entire ecosystems, and maintained the delicate balance that allowed modern civilization to exist without destroying the natural world it depended on. But David also understood that the same chemicals that protected millions of lives could kill millions of lives if mishandled, weaponized or sabotaged by people who saw industrial facilities as symbols rather than systems. The 5 people who infiltrated Riverside Chemical at 2:30 a.m. called themselves the Environmental Liberation Front, but their leader, Dr. Angela Foster, preferred the term eco-warriors. At 35, she had a PhD in environmental science from Berkeley, 6 years of experience with Greenpeace, and an absolute conviction that industrial chemical plants were poisoning the planet 1 gallon at a time. Foster's team consisted of dedicated environmentalists who'd spent months studying Riverside Chemical's operations, not to understand them, but to expose them. Jake Morrison, a former chemistry student turned activist, had researched the facility's chemical processes to identify the most dramatic ways to demonstrate industrial pollution. Lisa Park, a documentary filmmaker, was prepared to record evidence of environmental crimes that she believed were being hidden by corporate secrecy. The other 2 team members, Michael Torres and Jessica Walsh, were seasoned environmental protesters who'd been arrested at pipeline demonstrations, factory blockades, and corporate headquarters occupation. They brought tactical experience and absolute moral certainty to operations that they viewed as necessary environmental defense. What united Foster's team was their belief that Riverside Chemical represented everything wrong with industrial capitalism. A facility that processed toxic chemicals in secret, released pollutants into the environment for profit, and maintained operations that threatened public health while hiding behind corporate lawyers and regulatory capture. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. Infiltrate the facility during minimal staffing, document evidence of environmental violations, and create a controlled chemical release that would expose the dangers of industrial pollution without causing permanent damage. The resulting media coverage would force regulatory investigations, corporate accountability, and public awareness of environmental threats that were being hidden by industrial secrecy. Foster's team had spent 6 months preparing for their operation. They'd studied facility blueprints, analyzed staffing patterns, and researched chemical processes that would create maximum visual impact with minimal environmental consequences. They'd even consulted with sympathetic chemistry professors, who'd provided technical advice on how to create dramatic but containable chemical reactions. What they hadn't studied was David Kingston, the man whose 15 years of experience had taught him to recognize exactly the kind of idealistic catastrophe that was about to unfold. David's first indication that something was wrong came at 2:47 a.m., when his routine monitoring check revealed pressure irregularities in Processing Unit 7, the section of the facility that handled chlorine production for municipal water treatment. The readings weren't dangerous, but they were inconsistent with normal operations. And David's 15 years of experience had taught him that inconsistencies in chemical processing were never random. His second warning came from the facility's motion detection system, which registered movement in areas that should have been empty during night shift operations. The alerts were subtle, brief activations that could have been caused by equipment vibrations or small animals, but they formed a pattern that suggested coordinated human activity in sections of the plant where unauthorized personnel could cause catastrophic accident. David's response reflected 15 years of learning that chemical plant emergencies required immediate action based on incomplete information. He activated the facility's soft lockdown protocol, which sealed external entrances while allowing normal operations to continue, and began a systematic inspection of areas where unauthorized activity had been detected. What he found in Processing Unit 7 confirmed his worst fears and validated every safety protocol he'd spent years developing. 5 people in dark clothing were working with sophisticated equipment around the chlorine processing tanks, clearly attempting to manipulate chemical flows in ways that would create dramatic releases of gas and liquid that would be visible from miles away. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they understood industrial chemistry, but David's trained eye immediately recognized that their actions would create consequences far beyond their intention. The chlorine system they were sabotaging wasn't just a processing unit. It was connected to the facility's emergency neutralization system, which was designed to contain chemical leaks by mixing dangerous materials with counteracting agents. If Foster's team succeeded in their planned exposure of chlorine processing, they would disable the safety systems that prevented small leaks from becoming regional disasters. David faced a dilemma that 15 years of chemical plant experience had prepared him for theoretically, but never practically. How to stop well-intentioned people from causing the exact environmental disaster they believed they were preventing. David's approach to the situation reflected his understanding that environmental activists weren't criminals. They were idealists who didn't understand that their good intentions could produce catastrophic results. Rather than immediately calling security or law enforcement, he decided to engage directly with Foster's team, using his technical knowledge to explain why their operation would achieve the opposite of their environmental goals. "Excuse me," David said, stepping into the area where Foster's team was working. "I'm David Kingston, night supervisor for this facility. I need to explain something about what you're doing." Foster's team immediately went into defensive positions, clearly prepared for confrontation with security personnel. But David's calm, non-threatening approach seemed to confuse them. "We're here to document environmental crimes," Foster announced, "and we're not going to be intimidated by corporate security." David's response reflected his years of learning that technical education was more effective than confrontation. "Foster, I recognize you from your research publications on industrial pollution. I've actually read your work on chlorine gas exposure in industrial communities. But I need to explain something about the system you're trying to expose. Foster's surprise at being recognized seemed to create an opening for dialogue rather than confrontation. What you're attempting to do, David continued, pointing to the chlorine processing equipment, will create exactly the kind of environmental disaster that your research warns against. This isn't just a processing unit. It's part of an integrated safety system that prevents the kind of toxic releases that killed people in Bhopal. David's technical explanation revealed his deep understanding of both industrial chemistry and environmental consequences. If you disable this chlorine system the way you're planning, you'll create a gas cloud that will force the evacuation of 3 cities and contaminate groundwater that supplies drinking water to 2 million people. You'll prove your point about industrial dangers by creating an industrial disaster. The silence that followed suggested that Foster's team was beginning to understand that their environmental activism was about to cause the environmental catastrophe they were trying to prevent. What followed was an impromptu chemistry lesson that demonstrated the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. David walked Foster's team through the facility's operations, explaining how industrial chemical processing worked to protect rather than threaten environmental safety. Foster, David said, leading the group to a monitoring station. These chemicals that you see as pollutants are actually what make clean water possible. Without chlorine treatment, waterborne diseases would kill more people in a month than industrial accidents kill in a decade. David's explanation revealed the complexity of environmental protection that academic study couldn't capture. This facility processes chemicals that neutralize industrial waste, purify drinking water, and prevent environmental disaster. We're not hiding pollution. We're preventing it by processing dangerous materials in controlled conditions, rather than letting them accumulate in the environment. Jake Morrison, the former chemistry student, asked the question that revealed the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. But what about the toxic waste products? What about the environmental impact of chemical manufacturing? David's answer demonstrated 15 years of learning, but environmental protection required understanding industrial processes rather than opposing them. Jake, everything you see here is designed to minimize environmental impact while maximizing environmental benefit. The waste products are neutralized, the emissions are filtered, and the end products prevent environmental disasters that would be orders of magnitude worse than any impact from controlled manufacture. David led the team to the facility's environmental monitoring station, which tracked air quality, water purity, and soil contamination in real time. We're not hiding environmental data, we're generating it. This facility has reduced regional water contamination by 85% since it opened, eliminated 3 sources of groundwater pollution, and prevented dozens of environmental disasters by processing dangerous materials safely. Foster's team was beginning to understand that their environmental activism was targeting the solution rather than the problem. David's most powerful argument came when he showed Foster's team the consequences of their planned sabotage. Using computer models that predicted environmental impact with scientific precision. Foster, David said, pulling up environmental simulation software. Let me show you what happens if you successfully disable this chlorine system. The computer model displayed a horrifying scenario. Toxic gas clouds spreading across 3 counties, groundwater contamination lasting decades, and environmental damage that would affect millions of people for generations. Your planned exposure of industrial pollution would create the worst environmental disaster in Ohio history, David continued. You'd prove that chemical plants are dangerous by turning this one into the weapon you believe it already is. Lisa Park, the documentary filmmaker, stared at the projections with growing horror. But we researched this. We consulted with chemistry professors. They said a controlled release would be containable. David's response revealed the gap between academic theory and industrial reality. Lisa, your consultants understand chemistry, but they don't understand this chemistry. Industrial processes are integrated systems where every component affects every other component. You can't create a controlled release of chlorine gas without disabling the systems that make releases controllable. Michael Torres, one of the experienced activists, asked the question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. So you're saying that trying to expose environmental dangers would create environmental danger? I'm saying, David replied, that the best way to protect the environment is to understand how environmental protection actually works. This facility exists because uncontrolled chemical processes are infinitely more dangerous than controlled ones. David's final demonstration was the most compelling. He showed them real-time data from environmental monitoring stations across the region, proving that areas served by Riverside Chemical had cleaner air, purer water, and healthier ecosystems than areas without industrial chemical processing. Your environmental activism is targeting the infrastructure that makes environmental protection possible, David concluded. You're not fighting pollution. You're fighting the systems that fight pollution. Foster's team found themselves facing a crisis of ideology that their environmental training hadn't prepared them for. They'd infiltrated Riverside Chemical to expose environmental crimes, only to discover that stopping their operation would commit environmental crimes that dwarfed anything they'd imagined corporate polluters were hiding. David, Foster said, if what you're saying is true, then everything we believed about industrial pollution is wrong. David's response reflected his 15 years of learning that environmental protection was more complex than environmental activism. Foster, industrial pollution is real, and environmental protection is essential. But effective environmental protection requires understanding industrial processes well enough to make them safer, not stopping them entirely. The choice you're facing, David continued, is between environmental activism that feels righteous and environmental protection that actually works. You can create a disaster that proves your point about industrial dangers, or you can learn how to prevent industrial dangers through better industrial practices. Jake Morrison voiced the question that their entire operation had been built around. But if we don't expose these environmental threats, how do we create change? David's answer reflected his years of working within industrial systems to make them more environmentally responsible. Jake, you create change by understanding systems well enough to improve them. I've spent 15 years making this facility safer, cleaner, and more environmentally responsible. That's environmental activism that produces environmental results. David offered Foster's team an alternative to their planned sabotage. Instead of creating an environmental disaster to prove that environmental disasters are possible, help me prevent environmental disasters by learning how environmental protection actually works. What followed was unprecedented in both environmental activism and industrial security. A chemical plant night supervisor, educating environmental activists about how environmental protection was actually accomplished through industrial expertise rather than industrial opposition. David spent the next 3 hours walking Foster's team through every aspect of Riverside Chemical's operations, explaining how environmental safety was maintained through technical knowledge, regulatory compliance, and continuous improvement of industrial processes. Foster, David said as they completed their tour of the facility, you have the academic background to understand these systems. What you haven't had is the practical experience to see how environmental protection works in real-world conditions. Foster's response reflected a fundamental shift in her understanding of environmental activism. David, our research showed us industrial pollution, but it didn't show us industrial pollution prevention. We saw the problem, but we didn't understand the solution. David's offer was simple but revolutionary. Dr. Foster, Riverside Chemical needs environmental scientists who understand industrial processes. Your expertise in environmental impact could help us improve systems that protect millions of people every day. Lisa Park, the documentary filmmaker, asked the question that would determine how their night of environmental activism would end. What if we documented this instead? What if we showed people how environmental protection actually works rather than how industrial pollution threatens the environment? David's agreement led to an outcome that neither environmental activists nor industrial security had ever imagined. A collaboration between people who'd been adversaries but shared the same ultimate goal of protecting the environment through different means. Instead of sabotaging Riverside Chemical to expose environmental dangers, Foster's team spent the remainder of the night documenting environmental protection systems that most people never knew existed. Lisa Park's cameras captured the sophisticated monitoring systems that tracked environmental impact in real time, the emergency response procedures that prevented small problems from becoming large disasters, and the continuous improvement processes that made industrial operations safer and cleaner every year. Jake Morrison used his chemistry background to document the technical processes that transformed dangerous raw materials into beneficial products while minimizing environmental impact through engineering solutions rather than regulatory restrictions. Foster herself focused on the environmental science that made industrial environmental protection possible. The integration of chemistry, engineering, and ecology, that allowed human civilization to exist without destroying the natural systems it depended on. David, Foster said as dawn broke over the Riverside facility, "We came here to expose environmental crimes, but we've discovered environmental solutions that we never knew existed." David's response reflected his 15 years of learning that environmental protection required collaboration rather than confrontation. Dr. Foster, the best environmental activism is environmental education. People can't protect what they don't understand. 6 months later, Dr. Angela Foster joined Riverside Chemical as Director of Environmental Compliance, bringing her academic expertise to bear on improving industrial processes from the inside rather than opposing them from the outside. Lisa Park's documentary The Environmental Protectors: How Industrial Chemistry Saves the Environment won Environmental Film Awards and changed public understanding of how environmental protection actually worked in practice rather than theory. Jake Morrison completed his chemistry degree and became a safety engineer specializing in preventing industrial accidents through better system design rather than system elimination. David Kingston was promoted to Director of Environmental Safety, overseeing improvements that made Riverside Chemical a model for environmental responsibility in industrial operations. But the most important outcome was the recognition that environmental protection required technical expertise, practical experience, and collaboration between people who understood environmental science and people who understood industrial systems. 3 years later, David received a letter from the Environmental Protection Agency, recognizing Riverside Chemical as the cleanest industrial facility in Ohio and crediting the collaboration between environmental scientists and industrial engineers for innovations in pollution prevention that had been adopted by chemical plants nationwide. But the letter also included a detail that meant more to David than official recognition. "Mr. Kingston, your willingness to educate environmental activists about environmental protection has created a new model for collaboration between industry and environmental groups. Your work proves that the best environmental protection comes from people who understand both environmental science and industrial processes." Foster's first environmental compliance report and a photo of the team that had once planned to sabotage the facility but had instead helped make it an environmental success story. To him, it represented something more important than professional achievement: proof that environmental protection required understanding environmental solutions, not just environmental problems. The environmental activists who'd infiltrated Riverside Chemical had come to expose industrial pollution, only to discover that the most effective environmental protection came from people who understood industrial processes well enough to make them cleaner, safer, and more environmentally responsible. David Kingston had proven that sometimes the most important environmental activism happens not in protests or sabotage, but in the daily work of people who understand that protecting the environment requires working with industrial systems rather than against them. His 15 years of experience had taught him that environmental disasters were prevented not by stopping industrial processes, but by making them so safe and clean that environmental protection and industrial production became the same goal pursued through different means. And every night, as David walked through the Riverside facility where chemicals that could kill millions were processed into products that saved millions, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that environmental protection was most effective when it was practiced by people who understood both the dangers and the solutions that made modern environmental safety possible. If you enjoyed this story of environmental protection through technical expertise, the collaboration between activists and industry professionals, and the moment when good intentions met practical solutions, don't forget to subscribe to Industrial Security Stories. We explore the untold accounts of the people who protect our environment by understanding the systems that make modern life possible. Have you ever discovered that a problem you thought you understood was actually more complex than you realized? Share your stories of learning that changed your perspective in the comments below. Remember, in a world where environmental protection requires both passion and expertise, sometimes the most effective activism comes from understanding systems well enough to improve them rather than oppose them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.